Here we go. I'm Gus Hellman, 76 years old, living in the flyover part of the country. Why do many people who are not rabid political nor staunch liberal conservatives still getting their information mostly from mainstream media? Are they too pressed for time to take insights like Bill Whittle's? They don't go looking for this type of report commenting because they are lying to themselves or not as open to the possibility that the media can be or is this corrupt. Gus, good to hear from you. Thank you for the support. I think the last hour of me is hopefully will have answered that question. More people are not coming to watch BillWhittle.com. I'm not saying that it's worth watching. I'm just simply saying it is worth watching, obviously, because we talk about these ideas. But the reason more people aren't coming is not because they're lazy, and it's not because they're dependent on the mainstream news media. They're not coming here because the choice of coming here has been especially eliminated from them. And in the course of 4 or 5 years, the number of people that find this site, which you would think would be increasing over time, is actually about a 20th of what it was, maybe less, than when we first started BillWhittle.com after PJTV went away. I bet we get a 20th of the links that we used to get. And in a world where this wasn't happening, it seems to me that logically, if somebody comes for the content and likes it, then they'll come back. And if new people come for the content, they will stay. But there's not going to be a lot of people actually removing themselves from the content. So that number should get bigger, but it doesn't. It's getting smaller. It's getting smaller faster. So that's that. He's got another question too, so it's good to answer. Let's have a look at this one. Are humans born predisposed with good or evil predisposition? Do we all have a willingness to fight to the death for self-preservation without being taught not to do that? This is an interesting question as well. I'll deal with the good or bad in a minute. We were talking earlier, Gus, about how Richard Dawkins wrote this book called The Selfish Gene, and Dawkins was trying to explain something that's very difficult for genetics to explain, at least in a simple term. And Dawkins, as a genetics writer and researcher, he's a brilliant guy. There's no question about it. But the problem that people were having was that if genes are there to preserve the organism, and that the only thing that the genes care about is that the organism lives long enough to reproduce itself so that the genes continue, that explains a lot of things. It explains why we get old. You know, we get old because we're not needed anymore. In fact, there's an evolutionary advantage to us aging, and that is we start out, our bodies are young and firm and in good shape. We have kids that we've done our job by feeding the gene pool, and now new kids are on the scene, and we're not just obsolete or redundant. We're actually destructive. It wants change. Put that aside. Hawkins's problem and the problem of geneticists was, why is it that so many people are willing to go and throw themselves, on top of grenades or be the 3 people who volunteer to swim underneath a melting down nuclear reactor at Chernobyl? Why would somebody jump into an ocean filled with sharks, or why would somebody give somebody else the lifeboat seat on a sinking ocean liner? Why would they do that? There's no evolutionary explanation of that. At least there wasn't until Dawkins came along. It was a. I'm not saying he did all this on his own, but it was a tough nut to crack. If genes are about surviving, then what is it about the human genetic structure that has people willing to die when that should be the one thing that the gene is fighting against all the time? In other words, it'd be easy to understand that if a lifeboat was going down and everybody had civilization, but when the lifeboat started to go down, it'd be easy to understand that the men would be punching the children and throwing them overboard, and the women too, because the desire to survive is overwhelming. That's not what happens. At least it can be made so that that's not what happens. So what's going on there? And he was able to devise something that I think makes sense. He was able to basically say that it's not the individual gene so much as it is the gene cohort. In other words, if I have a tribe of people who are an every man for itself kind of tribe, they are only concerned with their own survival. And then I have a genetic mutation, some kind of cosmic ray causes a defect in the genetic code, and that creates a group of people who are willing to give their lives for the other people. This genetic freak, this mutation. Then if I look at two of these populations, which one is more likely to survive? And it turns out clearly that the population that has the altruistic gene, the willingness to sacrifice the individual for the greater good, is going to be far more successful than the one that is just people looking out for number one. And so over time, natural selection has actually chosen altruistic behavior that is destructive for the individual because it's good for the tribe, it's good for the group, that particular cohort. So the willingness to fight for the death of self-preservation without being taught not to do that, I think that's such a profoundly good point, Gus, because, I don't want to get into like national, yes, I do. It's hard to imagine the Titanic story being played out the same way if that were a French ocean liner and everybody on board it was French. I just don't. I can't believe it. I don't. And then you can go further and further and further down the line and get to it being more and more unlikely. So finally, you get to if the Titanic had been filled with nothing but Berkeley professors, then people would be ripping children's eyes out. So we have the ability to be altruistic, but it's important. And again, I'm coming at this from a genetic background because I think I think this is basically how this particular hunk of matter is built. The number one motivation for virtually all animals is self-preservation. They'll eat each other if they're starving. Finally, it's just, and that makes evolutionary sense. The one thing that the organism has to do is survive long enough to pass down the genes. That's the whole idea of this selfish gene. So what I think we have is I genuinely don't know. I don't know the answer to this. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that if you could isolate the altruism gene, that you would find that gene dispersal is not the same throughout the population, that there would be some cultures that would have more of it and some that would have less, but I don't think any of them have none of it. So let's just say that the ability to be able to throw yourself on a grenade, and I say be able to, meaning that you are capable of making a decision like I'm going to give my only life right now for my buddies. The capability of having that kind of altruistic behavior is obviously built into the human being, or else we wouldn't see it happen. But I don't think I don't think it comes close to overweighing the desire for personal survival. But you said you got it right on the nose. Do we all have a willingness to fight to the death for self-preservation without being taught not to do that? And then you get to the real issue. The reason that it was women and children first on the Titanic was because British gentlemen this was how they grew up. This was what they did. This is how they were behaving and how they were expected to behave. And the idea of surviving an ocean liner sinking from under you by pushing ahead of women and children is more painful than dying in the water. It is a more painful choice if you've been brought up that way. The idea that you would live, but for the rest of your life you'd be seen as a coward, and you'd be seen as a person who didn't have the fundamental humanity that a gentleman was expected to have. That's a fate worse than death, and that's why those men often verbally saying, "I'm going to die like a gentleman." They would rather do that than live, because life after that would be worse than being dead. And we know this to be true because one of them actually did it. Ismay. Joseph Bruce Ismay was the man who owned the Titanic. He was one of the owners of the White Star Line that built the Titanic. And when that ship went down, he found himself in the line for one of the lifeboats. There is some controversy about whether or not he was in women's clothes, but most people think that he was. That he had basically snuck on board this lifeboat wrapped in a woman's shawl, and that his fear had overcome his expected behavior as a gentleman. And worse than that, clearly Ismay bears some moral responsibility for what happened, if for no other reason than he was the guy who said, yeah, we don't need lifeboats for everybody. It was certainly the White Star's position to make this the fastest crossing ever, this first crossing. Captain Smith was going through a known ice field much faster than he should have, and so on. That didn't come from Captain Smith, it came from White Star. So now you've got a situation where a guy who's morally responsible for the death of 1,000 people is going to avoid the consequences of that by basically putting himself first and going against his social code. His fear outweighed his sense of honor. For the rest of his life, which was not a pleasant life, he did not. Okay, Dave Big Booty said he did not dress in women's clothes. Yeah, glad I qualified it. But for the rest of his life, people would cross the street to avoid passing him on the sidewalk. No one spoke to him. No one talked to him. No one ever invited him over for cards, or no one invited him over the holidays. He became a non-person. He was sneered at openly whenever anybody had a chance to, but even when they didn't have a chance to openly express how low they thought he was, they expressed it by simply completely ostracizing him. He became a guy who, you wanted to live. Well, now you're living. Now your life is living, and your life is going to be a living hell because you violated the code. And the code gives you enormous benefits. Joseph Bruce Ismay, it gives you the deferential treatment of the entire population. It gives you first-class accommodations. It gives you better food, better all this other stuff. Those are all the benefits you get from being a gentleman, Bruce Ismay. But you have a concurrent obligation and duty. And the reason people despised him was that he tried to have it both ways. He wanted his cake and eat it too. He wanted all the advantages of a gentleman, but he wasn't ready to pay the price for it when the time came. So, like I say, I really don't. And I know this sounds just like it's just intended to be a slur, and I'm not. And I don't have a kind of emotional drive behind it. Sometimes I do, but I don't in this case. I do not imagine that this story would have come out the same way if it had been a French ship filled with French people, only because that code of gentlemanness, the idea of being a gentleman was so distinctly British and so clearly defined that it became part of their lives from the moment they're born. You're a gentleman. You will be able to essentially do whatever you want to, rule over the common class, but you will have some obligations, and those are you'll have an obligation to take care of them, have an obligation to not dishonor the family, and so on. You'll have an obligation to act like a gentleman, and that was taught to them. So do we have the willingness to fight for the death for self-preservation without being taught not to do that? I don't think so. I don't think. Then again, you know what? I'm not sure. You could have a person who didn't have anything. Let's just take somebody who was in fact, I'm sure that's not required. It just helps. It's not difficult to imagine at all. Some Indian of the untouchable case who is on board shining somebody's shoes. It's not difficult to imagine that person sacrificing his life for a child he's never seen before, even though he has no connection to those people. He's got that altruistic thing. Now, AK-47 for now says, you're starting to sound like someone who believes human nature can be altered with I think it's a little smiley face. I can't make it out from here. On the contrary, I'm saying that the Titanic went down the way it did because the hardware was established, and that whether that hardware meant it was carrying different software or not, whatever the fact may be, is that the software was definitely different on the Titanic than it would have been on a French ship, for example, and that the software that the people on the Titanic were running was defined by the fact that there was their obligation to not get into the lifeboat. So, Gus, I think the answer is it is possible to teach people that that there is a nobility of sacrifice when the time comes, and women and children first, and that if you teach that, you will get a lot of individuals who are basically going to obey the women and children first. But no matter how much you teach it, you're going to get people like Bruce Ismay, who's been taught it his whole life, and that teaching will not overcome his biological imperative to run away. And furthermore, there are people out there who will perform those altruistic behaviors without having been taught it at all. So it's just a giant bell curve of likelihood. From one end, it's like you never help anybody ever, to the other person who's always going to help everybody all the time. And you can shift that curve a little bit, maybe significantly by teaching those values, but nevertheless, it's still a bell curve, and that's what you're stuck with. Okay, let's see what we got here.